Hiroshima, August 6, 1945. The city was beginning yet another ordinary day in the middle of the war. Children were putting on their school uniforms. Shopkeepers were opening their stores. Civil servants were arranging their papers in their offices. Despite the conflict ravaging the world, there was still a certain routine, a kind of forced normalcy, sustained by habit and by the hope that, maybe, the worst had already passed. But at 8:15 a.m., everything stopped. An American plane flying at high altitude dropped a bomb with an almost ironic name, Little Boy. In less than a second, the center of the city turned into fire, light, and silence. A heat explosion so intense that it melted steel, evaporated bodies, and etched human shadows onto the walls. 140,000 people died, many instantly, others slowly, consumed by radiation and pain. In the days that followed, while the world was still trying to understand what had happened, rescue teams began to walk among the rubble. They found unrecognizable remains, twisted structures, fragments of interrupted lives. Amid the total destruction, something unlikely was discovered. A note, a simple piece of paper, partially burned, folded with the care of someone who protects a secret. The text was still legible. It was short, direct. A message left by someone on their way somewhere, or perhaps promising to return. There was no full name, no address, just an initial and a promise. A fragile detail in the face of the magnitude of the explosion, yet one that carried an almost unbearable weight. What was that note doing there? Who wrote it? For whom? And why did these words, among so many others, survive when almost nothing else did? To understand the weight of that note, we need to go back in time and look at the context in which it appeared. World War II, in 1945, was in its final stages. After years of combat, the Allies were close to defeating the Axis. But Japan, still defiant, continued to resist. The war in the Pacific dragged on with increasing brutality, with no end in sight. At that point, the United States, with the help of its allies, had already achieved significant victories. Still, the war against Japan seemed far from a quick resolution. Japanese resistance was immense, and casualties on both sides were rising by the day. The idea of invading the Japanese islands seemed increasingly unthinkable, given the human cost such an operation would bring. That's when the US made a radical decision: the use of the atomic bomb. The first bomb, called Little Boy, was dropped on Hiroshima, an industrial city with a population of around 350,000 people. The impact was immediate and devastating. The explosion destroyed 90% of the city within seconds, causing an incomprehensible number of deaths. The extreme heat incinerated everything in its path, and the radiation that followed brought illness and death in the days and months ahead. But amid all that destruction, a note was found. And perhaps in some way it was a testimony to what Hiroshima represented at that moment. Not just the devastation of a city, but the end of one era and the beginning of another, marked by nuclear destruction. After the explosion, the city of Hiroshima became a scene of indescribable devastation. There were no streets left, only a heap of rubble and ash. What once were houses, schools, shops, and hospitals were now charred ruins, shapeless, lifeless. The survivors wandered through the wreckage, dazed, trying to find something that could connect them to what had once been their lives. It was in this chaos that, at some point amidst the destruction, a piece of paper appeared. It was burned, the edges scorched, but still readable. When it was found, no one knew exactly where it came from. How had it survived such a powerful explosion? And what did it mean? The note was nothing more than a simple promise. Wait for me. I'll be back before autumn. K. But those few words carried an unmatched weight. The letter seemed to hold no material value, nothing more than a plain piece of paper. Yet in the midst of so much suffering, so much loss, that note represented something profound, a fragment of humanity that survived the barbarity. Who was Kay, For whom were those words written? And more painfully, who had received this letter, and who had lost everything, including the chance to reunite with the one they loved? The note, though small and seemingly insignificant, became a symbol of a much greater tragedy, one that affected millions and still echoed in the ashes of Hiroshima. The discovery of the note raises questions that may never be answered. Who was Kei? Who received that hopeful message in a moment of absolute despair? We know that Japan, in 1945, was on the brink of collapse, with a population scarred by war and uncertainty. But the note, though simple, suggests a more personal, more intimate story. And that's where the doubt begins. Who was behind those words? Could it have been a young soldier, somewhere in the city, perhaps separated from his family? Or a worker who, after the bombing, wrote to his wife, children, or friend, promising to come home? Maybe a student who, in the middle of the chaos, still believed in the possibility of a future. The letter didn't say much, but it said enough to imagine many stories. Stories of love, of promises made under the pressure of war, of people trying to hold on to a thread of hope in the middle of a nightmare. The fact that the note resisted the blast, that it survived Hiroshima's nuclear apocalypse, suggests it held special meaning for the one who wrote it. Maybe the author knew that the chances of return were slim, and that's why they made sure to leave one final message. The letter wasn't just any message. It was a link to the past, to the people the author loved. One last attempt to preserve human connection in a moment when the world was collapsing around them. The note, small and simple, yet filled with deep meaning, became a symbol of what many endured on that fateful day in Hiroshima. As the months passed and radiation continued to claim lives, the world began to grasp the true scale of the tragedy. But among the images of suffering, death, and destruction, the letter stood out. It represented, in some way, a final attempt to hold on to what was left of humanity amidst the devastation. That burnt piece of paper wasn't just a message from a man to someone dear. It was the embodiment of all the promises made and broken during the war, a cry of hope in the face of an uncertain future, and an effort to keep an emotional bond alive with those who, despite everything, still believed in tomorrow. The letter became a testimony of a humanity that refused to surrender to the cruelty of fate. Over time, the note was passed from person to person. People who felt moved by its story. Historians and researchers tried to learn more about the author, but he remained an enigma. Still, his message endured through generations. It spoke not only of the horrors of war, but also of the resilience of the human soul. Whoever wrote those words may have died with the dream of returning home, but their promise lived on, echoing far beyond what they could have imagined. That letter, small, simple, and almost lost in the ruins, outlived its author, the war, and even time itself. It became more than just a scrap of paper. It became a legacy, a reminder that even in the height of destruction, there is still room for hope, for purest emotion, and for the connection that defines us as human. When we look at the note found in Hiroshima, we are reminded of the immeasurable power that words can have, even in the most desperate circumstances. The letter wasn't just a means of communication. It was a silent resistance against death, against the annihilation of everything that person had once known. Amidst the destruction of a city and the loss of hundreds of thousands of lives, the words on that note survived. Not by accident, but because it was a link, a last attempt by someone to hold on to their humanity, to their love, and to their hope. In the darkest moments, words have the power to connect us, to remind us who we are and what is still possible. The simple message, "I'll be back before autumn," resonated almost magically, as if the author knew, even without seeing the future, that they would not be forgotten. Even when the world seemed to have collapsed, he left something behind, something that still carried life. And it doesn't matter that the promise was never fulfilled. The power of a word lies in the impact it makes, and the Hiroshima letter not only kept a man's memory alive, but also the spirit of resistance in all those who suffered. The letter, in its simplicity and desperation, revealed something even deeper: the human desire to be remembered, not erased by oblivion. In a world where everything seemed to vanish into ashes, those few words endured, still speaking to the future, insisting that the past would not be completely destroyed. It shows how, so often, the simplest words and gestures carry the greatest weight and endure beyond time and space. The Hiroshima letter, found among the ruins of a shattered world, is more than a burned scrap of paper. It is a reflection of human resilience, of hope that refuses to die, even when everything around is falling apart. The story of Kay and the promise to return became a symbol of how words can be more powerful than any explosion, more lasting than any disaster. They cross time, echo through generations, and leave behind a legacy that can never be erased. This story, marked by loss and a promise, teaches us that sometimes the greatest value of a letter lies not in what it communicates, but in what it represents. Even when we cannot fulfill our promises, even when the circumstances are impossible, what we leave behind, our words, our emotions, can outlast time and tragedy. And those words may be what keep us alive in the memory of others. If you were moved by this story, imagine how many other letters are lost in time, waiting to be discovered, waiting to reveal something we don't yet know. The lost letters are out there, waiting to tell their stories, to leave their mark on the world. If you felt the power of a simple letter, don't miss the next episodes. What's hidden between the lines might change everything.